Tzompaxtle. This is not a dead man's story. It's a presentation that Professor John Gibler is going to give us today. I have a little bit of information here from him. If you had looked him up in the internet, you found the information that I also found. So John Gibler writes from and about Mexico. He's the author of Mexico Unconquered, Chronicles of Power and Revolt, and To Die in Mexico, Dispatches from Inside the Drug War. Professor Gibler has been living in and writing from Mexico since 2006. He's also correspondent for Pacifica Radio's KPFA in Mexico. He has reported on the ground from the Zapatista Other campaign, the protest against electoral fraud in Mexico City, and the uprising in Oaxaca. He has reported for Left Turn in These Times, Common Dreams, Yes Magazine, Color Lines, and Democracy Now! He was a Global Exchange Media Fellow from 2006 to 2008. He earned his MS degree at the London School of Economics in 2001, and he is presently visiting assistant professor of Latin American Studies at Hampshire College, and today he's here to present to us on San Tzompaxtle. This is not a dead man's story. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, thanks to Gloria and thanks to Denise and to everyone who helped out this together. I really appreciate it. Thanks to those who have come. We opened up a circle because it seems like it would fit. It would be good. So anybody who's coming in, if you want to join in inside the circle, please. So I'd like just to share with folks today a little bit of the experience of reporting about armed movements and state violence in Mexico and writing about it, and as well a few theoretical reflections based on the events and experiences. What I'll be talking about today is a part of an ongoing project. One part of it was published in Mexico just last month in this book called Tzompaxtle, La Fuga de un Guerrillero. La Fuga de un Guerrillero, which means like guerrilla fighter's escape, is the publishing industry's attempt to sabotage the story. The original headline was Esta no es la historia del muerto, which I'll talk a little about what that comes, which means this is not a dead man's story. So I made a plan, which is this, which I'll try to stick to and pack a lot in before we have a little bit more conversation. So in October of 1996, a group of 4 journalists in Chilpancingo, Guerrero, southern Mexico, were contacted to conduct an interview with the state command structure of the EPR, the Ejército Popular Revolucionario, which means Popular Revolutionary Army. This would be the first direct interview in clandestinity with the members of this guerrilla organization, which had only publicly presented itself a few months prior, in late June of 1996, at the 1-year anniversary of the Aguas Blancas massacre. In 1995, June 1995, a number of members of a grassroots campesino organization in Guerrero State was traveling to several municipal capital cities to protest, and they were ambushed by state police and massacred. 16 people died, 40 were injured. The state police recorded the events, doctored the video evidence, and leaked the edited video to the press to pose it as some kind of a confrontation between the members of this grassroots organization known as Organización Campesina de la Sierra del Sur, or the Southern Sierra Campesino Organization, OCSS. Shortly thereafter, the original footage was leaked directly to Televisa. Ricardo Rocha, Mexican reporter, broadcast live without consulting with his editors the unedited version showing the police massacre and the placing of weapons in dead people's hands, and the whole full and edited version, which caused a national scandal. Zedillo was president at the time, so the last pre-administration, and he, long story short, kind of pitched the case back and forth between the Supreme Court and the legislature until finally, in classic kind of pre-political fashion, the president basically gave the finger, el dedazo, to the governor of the state to step down. Then both the legislature and the Supreme Court certified that there had been a police massacre, but each denied having the institutional authority to prosecute a governor. And so basically the case remained in a kind of legal limbo of impunity, a kind of legalized form of impunity. The perpetrators of the massacre, the architects of the massacre, were never tried or sentenced for their crimes. So at the 1-year anniversary of that, it was a public presentation, a commemorative event, a demand for justice, and men and women in military uniform carrying rifles with their faces covered, kind of impromptu, very shoddily made face masks, cloth with quickly cut eye holes, took the stage and read their Manifesto of Aguas Blancas. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the presidential candidate in 1988, who would run again in 1994, would become one of the main architects of the PRD, Party of the Democratic Revolution, the electoral left in Mexico, was present that day, denounced the appearance of the guerrilla group as a pantomime, and it, took the media by storm, this appearance of a new guerrilla group. Keep in mind, in Mexico, in the early, mid-1990s, there had been the reappearance of armed revolution on January 1, 1994, with the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, the EZLN's January 1 declaration of war and capture of 7 municipalities in the state of Chiapas. This comes on the heels, January 1, 1994, a very symbolic date, because not only the eruption of the armed movement, but also the day that the North American Free Trade Agreement would come into effect, signed in 1992, to come into effect on January 1, 1994. This also comes after an incredible, decades of turbulence in Mexico and Mexican political history, of the consolidation of state power through the PRI, and a series of major social mobilizations that challenged that consolidation of state power. Of course, the students' movements culminating in 1968 with the state response to the October 2nd massacre, and the absolute impunity for that massacre. That itself became one of the pivotal events leading to the eruption of armed movements across the country, both urban and rural, directly articulating their taking arms as a response to the impossibility of participating either in the electoral process or a kind of social movement process through marches, rallies, and legal public means. That was met with a decade of massive political repression, the formation of the White Brigades, las Brigadas Blancas, which were the death squads in charge of seeking out and systematically detaining, torturing, disappearing, executing in the streets members of the different armed movements in Mexico, both urban and rural. Interestingly, the seat of that death squad apparatus was the DFS, Dirección Federal de Seguridad, which is the federal political police of the time. I'll come back to that. But so then you've got a series of major, impactful social movement events in Mexico. Very importantly, the 1985 earthquake in Mexico City, absolute ineptitude and also belligerence of the government to respond. So ineptitude, their inability to respond to the crisis, and belligerence, their attempt to hinder the civic responses. There's the famous cases of the students from UNAM who filed and created a line around the General Hospital, which was completely in ruins and had crumbled, to prevent the army from forcibly removing people still searching for survivors, because the PRI wanted to bulldoze, the government wanted to bulldoze the remains to get that image out of the press of this destroyed hospital. Famously, there were these student brigades that participated in blocking the army, and as one person tells, during that conflict, they found the maternity ward and rescued like 14 infants. So very much like intense life and death struggle that came out of something that was unforeseen in the political process, this earthquake. Leads up to the 1988 elections. There was a national support system for an alternative party coming from a kind of left direction, articulating a left direction, which is the Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas candidacy in '88. Famously, on the night of the elections, as the numbers are coming in, and it seems very clear that Cárdenas, the opposition candidate, is winning, the system crashes. The buildings are all locked down for several days, and then when they reappear, the PRI had won. Massive electoral or mobilizations against electoral fraud. This is all '88. Salinas comes in '88 and is the architect of the North American Free Trade Agreement. He had already been one of the main operators of early neoliberal reform in the '80s and privatization, but then kind of becomes its champion. He's campaigning to become the president of the World Trade Organization and like presenting Mexico as now we are fully and finally a first world nation, right? January 1 comes, the Zapatista uprising. 3 months later, the assassination of the chosen candidate for the next round of presidential elections, Colosio, which is just now 20 years, right? Internally, the PRI is in crisis. Socially, the nation is perceiving, like, the state is perceiving serious threats coming from the EZLN, which there's an initial bellicose response, bombarding, war. The Mexican army, of course, is vastly more militarily powerful than the insurgents, but there's an upsurge of protest in the urban centers, particularly Mexico City, which forces the government to suspend its military raid in Chiapas and to enter into a process of negotiations. Right? So in this political context, in June 1996, a new armed organization presents itself publicly. If you read the Aguas Blancas Manifesto, it is a document that is incredibly linked to the first declaration of the Lacandon Jungle, the way it articulates its grievances against the state. And it's coming from, in this case, it's both indigenous and campesino kind of political platform. It is ridiculed and mocked and derided in the press. And the response of the army is immediate kind of reactivation of the militarization of that region that had taken place during the 1970s with the Party of the Poor and the Civics. The Party of the Poor, the group whose leader figure was Lucio Cabañas, very active between '68 and '74. The Civics with Genaro Vázquez in the late '60s into the early '70s, '71, '72. And in this context, 4 journalists are contacted and offered the ability to be taken out into an undisclosed location to interview members of the state command. This would be the first direct interview with the EPR. They agree, and they follow a series of security protocols which have them going to various cities and walking by certain places, and a contact will come up and give them a piece of paper. They read the instructions on that piece of paper and have to take public transport and go to a different city. All of this, they finally arrive in Zumpango del Rio in the evening, somewhere between 7 and 8 o'clock on October 25th, 1996.
Sorry about this, I have no idea what that is. I'm so sorry.
And their final indication was that in the plaza in Zumpango del Rio, which is about a small town about 20 minutes outside of Chilpancingo, which is itself a small town, but the capital, political capital of the state of Guerrero, they were to look for someone wearing a Chicago Bulls cap. It's 1996. The Bulls are the jam. Like, everybody loves the Bulls, right? They show up, and there are a bunch of cats wearing Bulls caps. And they don't know who to talk to. So eventually, these 2 men, one young man's wearing a Bulls cap, walk by them and make like a signal, right? They get up, 4 journalists. One of them's got hair like mine, right? Beard. Like these people, a couple of the photographers carrying a big backpack, right? They kind of stick out, even though they're all Guerrerenses, right? They're citizens and native of the state of Guerrero, but they're from a little bit of a different culture, right, than the small towns of Pueblo del Rio, so they stand out. They get up and follow these 2 men. They walk down the street, make a turn, walk a bit down the street, and they hear a gunshot. And all of a sudden, the men they're with say everything's suspended, everything's canceled. Kid busts out his backpack, assembles an AK, and says, "We'll protect you guys, like hide under here." The journalists are starting to freak out. They say, "No, look, we're fine. You guys get out of here. Like, if somebody's like gonna bust, if like the army shows up or whatever, they're not gonna do anything to us. You guys run." And so the guy's like, "Okay, everything's canceled, suspended, they're off." That's that. They don't know what's going on. It takes them, they have to walk, like find where they were and like get back to the highway and then hitch a ride on a combi back to Tzompaxtle, and it was canceled. 9 days later, the EPR publishes a communique denouncing the disappearance of one of their members, Andrés Tzompaxtle. And then a series of communiques follow. The journalists realize that must have been someone who was there to meet them that night. Over the course of several months, there are newspaper articles following the story of the EPR demanding that the state present their member, their compañero, who had been disappeared. Right? The state is saying, well, nothing, no official response. A few weeks into this, a reporter walks up to the governor at the time, who was an interim governor because Rubén Figueroa, one of the architects of the massacre of Aguas Blancas, the EU had given him the dedazo, he'd stepped down, he'd resigned, and the interim governor is Ángel Aguirre, who right now is the governor again. He was the interim governor at the time. A reporter asked him, "Do you know about this EPR member who has been disappeared?" He says, "Of course I know about it. I'm the governor of the state," right? And he's like, "I can't give you any information." And walks off. So then that becomes a big news headline. The governor knows that this guy's disappeared, but he won't tell anybody anything. Of course, the governor then says, "What I really meant to say was because I'm reading the newspapers, I know that this group is denouncing this, right? But I don't know anything. That's your job. Like, I don't know anything about it, right?" But over the course of 4 months, there are several newspaper stories that follow the EPR demanding that the government present, like that's the technical term, right? This man has been forcibly disappeared, and they're saying, present him. Like, and then the whole judicial process, you're going to try him with who knows what kinds of crimes, organized crime, terrorism, rebellion, who knows. But they're trying to save the logic of the organization, these communiques, is to save someone from the experience of torture. And then in March of 1997, 2 newspaper stories, one in El Universal, one in La Jornada, where 2 reporters had been taken into a clandestine interview with the EPR somewhere in the Valley of Mexico, central Mexico, where Andrés Tzompaxtle told them, he was there, that he had been disappeared, brutally tortured for 4.5 months, and had escaped. And he was there, back inside the organization, to denounce the existence of clandestine prisons, disappearance, death squads, and the practice of torture. The story is published and totally forgotten. No one follows it up. One human rights organization, the Fray Vitoria, submits a complaint to the National Human Rights Commission, which is a governmental body quasi-autonomous from the federal government, called la Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos, CNDH, who constantly contacts the lawyers who wrote the complaint, saying, "Oh, we'd love to take up this case. Can you put us in touch with Andrés Tzompaxtle? How did you get in touch with him? This is a clandestine member of an armed organization," right? Of course, the lawyers are like, "We have no contact with him. We wrote this complaint based on the documents, right? Based on these denunciations of the organization itself, as well as video that was leaked to the press from the organization, and then these later interviews, right? So the CNDH ends up incorporating the complaint into a recommendation about forced disappearance in the 90s. Otherwise, the story is completely forgotten. Fast forward to 2006. In February, a number of men are driving down a highway, the car overheats, and they pull over. They open up the hood. They're trying to see what's going on. And the Federal Highway Police, Federal Highway Patrol, pulls over, starts to question them about what they're doing. And then the versions, there are several different versions that we'll get into in a second about what happens, what transpires. But two of the men there leave, and the other men are arrested. And they're originally accused of being Andrés Tzompaxtle, the Comandante Rafael of the EPR. Very quickly, that's changed in the press, and it's two of Andrés's brothers. But then they're also accused of being members of the EPR and sentenced with organized crime and terrorism, illegal possession of weapons, and thrown in jail. At that point, in 2006, with the state claiming to have two brothers now of Andrés, Andrés gives another clandestine interview to a reporter in Guerrero State and says, "Look, I'm here. I was disappeared for 4 months and tortured and escaped. These are my brothers. They have nothing to do with me. They're being basically imprisoned for being my blood relations, right, for having the same last name. They're not members of the organization. I'm here. I'm the one they want. They should come find me, leave my brothers out of it." Right? He makes this public denunciation. And at that time, leaks to the press a document that he had written about his months of torture, survival, which has the title Un viaje al infierno, primavera 1999, which is, a trip to hell, and then it's dated spring 1999. So the reporter in Chilpancingo Guerrero is a friend of mine, and he gives me a photocopy of this document in 2006. I stay up reading it all night, several times through, totally terrifying. And that is my first kind of contact with the story, direct contact, besides knowing that there's just this obscure case of forced disappearance. And there it becomes a part of a long-standing desire to report and write on armed movements in the state of Guerrero. And this becomes one of many stories that I've heard something about or find some kind of documentation of, and take on as something that I want to further explore, to report about. At this point, in 2006, my first experience living in Guerrero was in 1999, 2000. And in 2006, I was back in Mexico reporting on the Zapatistas' other campaign. And began a project of trying to go more in depth in the continued reality, life events of the armed movements in this region of the country. And at that, very aware of what I'll call, trying to think of a way to call this, a matrix of disregard that I wanted to be aware of and to avoid. And in this matrix of disregard, you have the official discourse of the state, you could say on the extreme right, of this matrix, and a kind of romanticization of the left on the extreme left, right? The official discourse, of course, is these are hoodlums, they're drug traffickers, this is a constantly terrorist criminal activity. And the extreme left would be these are hooded, masked, armed people. They're liberators. They're the truest form of social struggle or something like that, right? And I wanted to avoid either sides of that matrix, but to take these people seriously as human beings, right? To listen. Like that became which was also very directly influenced by the discourse, the language of the other campaign, which is a campaign of listening. It was built on listening. For those who don't know much about it, in 2006, the Zapatistas organized this thing called the Other Campaign, Otra Campaña, during the federal electoral campaigns of 2006, saying the electoral system is completely, irremediably useless, corrupt, unsalvageable, ineffective, and that some other kind of politics has to be constructed. We don't know what it is yet, they said, because we can't define it being only us, the Zapatistas. We have to talk about it, everybody, to be able to even talk about it, to be able to even define it. So they created this thing called the Other Campaign, which was structured around a national campaign tour of listening. So Marcos called himself, he's de Marcos, but then he called himself the zero delegate, like the non-delegate, basically, before the indigenous comandantes would travel across the country to listen, right, to movements of struggle, social mobilization across the country. I accompanied that for 20 states, 4 months, until it was stopped on May 3rd and May 4th in Mexico City due to the repression in San Salvador Atenco. So very much influenced by this kind of politics of listening. I took that as my methodology, if you will. Like I want to talk to them. I want to listen to them. I want to hear how they articulate what they're doing, why they're doing it, what it means, what are the stakes, what does it involve, and began that process of many years up into the present. And in that process, I'm able to come in contact with Andres Tzompaxtle and to begin a series of interviews with him. And this being a very, very intense process. Initially, just going into it, he obviously, once contacts established and there's a communication, obviously, taking it, Spanish translations of things I've written in English, things I've written in Spanish, here's what I do, here's the work I do, here's the kind of thing I'm interested in. I don't know what it would be yet because we haven't started yet. Maybe a book, maybe a magazine article, who knows? Depends on also what you're interested in. But a proposal, right, of do you want to be written about? Do you want to participate in something like this? He did. It began at the very beginning. I'm interested in political analysis, theoretical exploration, and also storytelling, and all of them together, right? So the narrative element of that, what narrative requires, terrifyingly, horrifyingly, is very similar to what the state requires when it tortures. I was thinking about this, right? The questions that a narrative journalist will ask are remarkably similar to the questions a torturer would ask. Where were you? What time of day was it? Who was there? Right? How did you get there? Narrative requires detail. Like if you go to journalism school, which I didn't, but I read books. But if you go to journalism school, I'm told what they tell you is detail, show, don't tell, right? That's one of mainstream journalism kind of dogmas, which there's a lot that I think is useful in that maxim, like any maxim should be suspended at times. But show, don't tell, there's a lot that's very useful there, and that's kind of the general approach to constructing compelling narrative detail, right? So going into this interview process with a very intense awareness of not wanting to reproduce the logic of a torture interrogation in a narrative interview, right? And the only way I could think of initially to even broach that was to just say that to him, to say exactly that, to take examples of, I took him Truman Capote's In Cold Blood translated into Spanish, right? It was an example of this is a sample text of mainstream narrative journalism in the United States. This is one of their classic texts of how to do this. And here's the way in which they'll talk about it being constructed, right? And I don't want to do this, but there's something similar to what is done here that I am interested in, which is narrative reconstruction of events, of real experiences, storytelling. And to tell him and to share with him the kind of behind the cameras, if you will, of the questions that a narrative journalist would ask. In the interview process, there were several things that he said that really stuck to me, and I quote them in here, and that provide a kind of guide through the way in which I wanted to approach his story. 3 of these quotes. One was when he told me, "Este no va a ser el libro del muerto. Aquí no se puede contar todo. No se va a contar todo." Which means this is not going to be a dead man's book. Can't tell everything here. Not everything can be told today. Which I immediately understood as him telling me that he's not going to tell me everything. Right? Which we could talk about that as kind of the requirements of clandestinity, in a way. He's still alive, active in a clandestine organization. So it's ridiculous. I can't ask him, so where are you living? What's it like there? You know, or anything like that. A whole realm of questions that narrative would love, but they're immediately off the table for very obvious reasons. But it also let me know he's not going to tell me everything, like, as an act of will, as an act of decision. Right? So I know that whole field of information exists that I don't have access to. And on the one hand, that honesty did something in me in terms of trusting him. Like the fact that someone would tell me explicitly, I'm not going to tell you everything, also in me, I perceived it as a sign of honesty, right? And created, or was a piece of creating a sense of trust. Two other things he said. One was, es indescriptible lo que me pasó. He said that at one point. It's indescribable what happened to me. It's unsayable what happened to me. And at another point he said, creo que cada vez que lo cuento va a ser diferente. Siempre es diferente cada vez que lo cuento. Right? Puede ser que es una parte del daño oculto o el sanamiento de esta cuestión. That's the direct quote. Which is, every time I tell the story, it's different. It's going to be a little bit different, and it is different every time I tell the story. Part of that, I think, is the hidden damage inside me. It's still there, and part of it is the process of healing that damage. So these two quotes of "it's unsayable, every time I tell it, it's different," also kind of show us the impacts of torture on memory, what torture does to memory, and what that does to a story. And that becomes very important when thinking about the relation of a story of this nature to state discourse and judgments of truth and trust also in a story. So when faced with this kind of a story, raises a number of issues. How do you research this? How do you report this, right? One of the first things, obviously the backbone of the entire story is just talking with him, which happened over over a couple of years, and long conversations. And at the beginning, I only asked him, of course we'd have many conversations that weren't a part of the interview, that were never recorded, that were conversations of us discussing the possibility of this project. And then the first recorded interview, it's literally, which, you know, obviously it's full agreement to have an audio recorded, taking notes. And it's like, podrías contar qué pasó? You know, like my first question, I was terrified. And it was something like, do you mind telling me what happened? Like that open. He talked for 5 hours. And then that session was done. Right? You know? And I transcribed it and I read it, and by the time the next question, I had like 2 or 3 questions. There's a series of interviews like this. And these kinds of narrative questions, or questions for narrative detail, came very, very, very much late in the process, right? At the first, it was just huge open questions and a lot of talking. And then transcribing that, rereading it. So, but I was confronted with, okay, in the core moment of this story, there are, you know, in different moments, 2 people present, in other moments maybe as many as 10 or 12 people present. And I'm speaking with one of those people, the person who received the violence and who survived the violence. And then there are all the people who perpetrated the violence, right? Who conducted the violence. And I can't ask them to tell me their stories. Or there's a difference between I can't and I choose not to. There's the perhaps slightly exaggerated assumption that the state will not tell, or that the perpetrators would not. It's impossible to get their stories, which is probably not technically true that it's impossible. It is extremely dangerous to seek after those stories, to try and find the torturers and ask them what they have to say about what they did, principally because they're also still active. They're also still in the business of doing what they do. And this I know for a fact. So I did not engage the state, like as a choice. Right? This is the story from the perspective of the person who survived the violence. I'm not going to engage the state, but I do want to find every trace possible. So I go and interview the journalists who went on that walk that night and only heard a gunshot and then had their interview canceled. And I interview all of them. I don't tell anyone at all for years that I have contact with Andres Tzompaxtle and that I'm in the process of interviewing, so no one knows that. And I interview the journalists, and they all tell me their story, which is fascinating because they all remember different things. And in the version, the chapter about them, I don't correct them when they make mistakes. I just say, Sergio told me, Maribel told me, Hector told me, Jesus told me. Right? Hector said this, and then on this part, Sergio said this. And then Maribel skipped over that part altogether. And then like that, right? And I just present what each person remembers. Part of that is because making echo with the impacts of torture on memory, memory itself is valuable. Memory itself is intensely fragile. And so you have these 4 people who lived through this thing together. They all remember it differently. But no one doubts that they were there. No one doubts that they went on that interview, that they heard a gunshot, that the interview was canceled. Somebody remembers the bull's cap, right? And somebody else remembers jumping over a barbed wire fence. 2 people remember that. Somebody else remembers another little detail. Somebody remembers the different towns that they had to go through before getting there differently than the other person, right? But these differences in the memories don't call into question that they were there, right? Which is something we'll come back to in the testimony of torture. Which, by the way, I noticed that Nora Strahilovic was here a couple of years ago, and I cite her work in the book because she also has something very important, I think, to say about the necessity of literary language in testimonies of atrocity, right? Like language that accepts ruptures and breakings to describe something like torture. But so I interviewed the journalist. I went to the National Newspaper Archives in Mexico City and found all of the tiny little newspaper articles that had come out in the local papers. And we find really useful little tidbits like the local reporter who had the governor say, "Of course I remember," or "Of course I know that this guy's disappeared. I'm the governor of the state. It's my job to know," right? And then later says, "Oh no, I didn't mean that." And, but also beyond that, very important little moments when the attempt to hermetically seal the practices of the state is cracked. And you see, for example, that the military intelligence services had an operation outside a parking structure where Andres had left a Volkswagen Bug that evening. They'd found a parking ticket in his pocket during torture and had mounted this whole operation to detain anyone who would go to pick up that vehicle. And when they went to get the car, local reporters got word, luckily it's a small town, they ran over there, were able to identify the parking structure and then interview the people there. And you have this one woman who testifies, "Yeah, these guys from CSN have been here for 6 months, but they said if we said anything to the press that we'd be in trouble, so no one said anything," right? But there are all these little moments, these little cracks that you're able to perceive going back and doing the archival work just in those local papers. Mainly El Sol de Acapulco was the best paper. They published the most articles about this. They followed the story most closely, most detailed attention. La Jornada, a little bit, El Sur, a little bit. And then interviewing the brother who was arrested in 2006, getting his story kind of from inside that process. Basically at one moment when they're finally figuring out that he's not his brother, this interrogator says to him, "A tu hermano lo tuvimos en las manos, se nos fue. Se van a chingar ustedes aquí unos años por culpa de tu hermano." Tan tan, right? Which is like, we had your brother in our hands, and he slipped out. So we're gonna fuck you guys right here. A couple of years, you're fucked for your brother. Right? That's what his brother was able to tell me. And then, in this attempt to document some version of the traces, right, I asked at one point Tzompaxtle, because Tzompaxtle is married, not through the state of the church, but through the organization, and has children with another member of the organization, his compañera, right, whom he references in his written document once as Nube. Right? When he's first detained, and he's thrown down on the ground, hooded, but his hands bound, he says goodbye to his, he says it in his own written testimony, se despide de Nube y el tesoro que tiene en sus manos. He says goodbye to Nube, cloud and the treasure she has in her hands. He later tells me the treasure is a child. And that it was his emotional necessity to like say goodbye forever, like because his job was to protect them at all costs during torture. So he had to have them out of his mind. That was his technique of survival. But because he mentions Nube in the documents, at the point I asked him about her and if it would be possible to interview her. They consulted it. He later told me that would not be possible. It's too much of a security risk. But I could submit written questions and they'd respond with written answers. I said, I'm actually really interested in orality and in the spoken word here. And would it be possible if I gave you my audio recorder, wrote down a few questions, but then you asked her the questions and recorded it? You guys had a conversation and you brought me back the recorder. He said, okay. And so I did that. I jotted down a few questions, gave him the recorder, and he went away and came back. So I have this audio recording of him talking with his compañera Nube, which as soon as I listened to it, transcribed it, I found was like probably the most important document in the book, and decided to publish it just as that. Like, tell this little story I'm telling now, the chapter and the transcription, with very minimal edits, mainly because initially, it's very funny, I had this pristine, like kind of dogmatic, like I will edit nothing, there would be no intervention besides the fact that I gave him the questions in the audio recorder and in publishing in a book that I'm writing. It's a little bit of an intervention, right, this whole author thing, but no other interventions, right? And when I talked to him about it and shared the transcription, he was like, oh no, you can't publish this like this. Like, she repeats herself 3 times here. You've got to cut 2 of them. Like, she says the same word 3 times. Like, nobody writes like that. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's kind of funny that you would tell me, but okay, yeah. So I'll do a minimal edit and like, see what you guys think. So we just had to do that. But so these were the kind of traces I was able to find. And then I sit down to write, and I'm painfully aware of all the absences and silences in the text. The silences, some of which that I've been told are going to exist by the person who lived it, right? The things I'm not going to tell you, the things I don't remember. It's always different every time I tell it. I know that there are all these silences that are going to be a part of the text. And then there's the silence of the state, right? In this case, it's because the state is so good at making noise, right? It has its full apparatus of establishing what constitutes language, speaking, knowledge, that it's an act of subversion to render in some way silent. The state is not silent, but it's not directly addressed. It's present at every point of the story. But, so then I'm like, how do I write this? And I'm trying to think about structure, and I very quickly decide to abandon the kind of traditional narrative journalism format, and to tell the story multiple times in the same book from the different perspectives. So chapter 1 is just the interviews with these journalists, kind of like telling how they get there, where they go, and what they experienced, and leaving all the mistakes. That, like, all the correct information is there, but it's also mixed in with the misrememberings that are part of the story, right? Then, in an incredibly dry prose, there's a chapter called Las Notas, or the news stories, which is just me writing on November 4th, 1996, El Sol de Acapulco, published on page A1, the news story with this headline. Boom. The news story begins with this quotation. And I walk through the 6 or so months of the 4 months of torture and the 2 months up until his appearance, just through these long quotations of the newspaper articles that appeared at the time. And in the 3rd chapter, the chapter title is written in italics, and it's Te arrancan del mundo, or they tear you from the world. And this is the chapter written from inside Andres' experience. And what I decided to do, because when I was transcribing the interviews, he would this is common amongst all people, but he would very frequently switch into the second person when telling me the story. So he's telling me his story, what he lived through. The 2 of us are sitting alone, and he's using second person, tú, right? Te agarran de atrás, te someten, te conectan los cables, right? They grab you from behind, they throw you down, they connect the cables to your ankles. He would use the second person so frequently that I realized two things. One, I would have to alter his language to take it out of the second person. And I'm constantly doing kind of like alterations to put it into a first person narrative, or to constantly say, he told me, he said to me, he said in the interview, constantly putting myself into the text. Or keep it in the second person, which I was thinking does a couple of things at once. One, the immediacy of the second person, the immediacy of that language. Two, the fact that it's actually, those are the words he said. Those are the words out of his mouth. And then three, I was thinking, well, one element of the dimension of this text could be, he told me the story, and I'm telling it back to him. And then I'm telling it back to him in front of everybody. Or it's an attempt to tell his story back to him publicly, the second person. So the way in which typographically I decided to do this is with an asterisk at the end of the first paragraph in the footnote that says, the two chapters, they tear you from the world, and un pedazo de ser, or piece of being, are composed on more than 30 hours of audio recorded interviews with Andrés Tzompaxtle, and a written document of his authorship that he shared with me. All the words that appear in italics are direct quotations from Tzompaxtle and are his words. Words that appear in quotation marks with no footnotes are from this document, A Trip to Hell, dated spring 1999. All other quoted material will be footnoted. And so you have this 40-page text that's an unbroken narrative in the second person of the experience of 4 months of torture. And then it breaks. There's a chapter called The Silences, which is where at 3 times I kind of put myself in a period of reflection and kind of essay and share this kind of stuff with the reader. Like I quote the 3 times Andres told me that he wouldn't tell me everything. He doesn't, it's unsayable what he lived through, and it's always different when he tells the story. But the idea here is, I saw myself kind of posed with 2 demands. Always trying to meet 2 demands. One demand was to, word I use for myself, honor this story. More than tell the story, to honor it. And the other was to write all moments with honesty. To be honest with the readers, what I know and how I know it. So not to make a statement about, to not make an unsourced statement of my knowledge. This is what Gerardo, Andres' brother, told me. This chapter is composed on 30 hours of interviews with Andres. This is what was written in El Sol de Acapulco on November 4th, 1996. This is what Gloria Arenas told me in an interview. Constantly trying to sourcing directly for the readers. And then also reflecting on the dilemmas posed by a story of this nature. One of the other essay chapters is called, Is It Possible to Write Without Violence? And engages a couple of theoretical issues, but also directly with the practice of journalism. And a fascinating essay by Janet Malcolm called The Journalist and the Murderer, where she begins by saying any journalist worth his or her, any journalist not too stupid to know what's going on knows that what he does is morally indefensible. That's the quotation, Janet Malcolm. And she elaborates this very complex and intriguing, exhaustively reported, very well written argument about the kind of, she calls it moral anarchy of journalism, and comes to a position where she kind of advocates for an embracing and acceptance of one element of moral anarchy. And she discusses it in the tension between, she uses the word subject, I don't like that word, but she uses the word subject, the subject's kind of desire and drive to tell their own story, and the writer's kind of responsibility to disbelieve or suspend trust in everything the subject says. It has to be, so she's kind of opening up a space for journalists to not manipulate, but to interrogate people they're writing about. For obvious reasons, thinking about this particular story, that was not a position that I wanted to embrace. And I wanted to kind of think about why and what are the kinds of differences. And I think, well, obviously there's some race and class issues with Janet Malcolm, a New Yorker reporter, white woman interviewing two white men, right, for her book, The Journalist and the Murderer. And it's very different if a white male-bodied person goes to interview an indigenous Nahuatl, native Nahuatl speaker, right, in Mexico. It's the body politics, the whole political spectrum, I think, is very different. The colonial difference, right, that's one of the theoretical terms that I think is very useful. Walter Mignolo, right? He's not the first or the only person to talk about that. But that there would have to be some kind of a different approach when one is reporting from across the colonial difference. It's something I try to just kind of flesh out and share with the reader, and the very structure and entire approach to the book is itself an attempt to do something like that. So this is kind of what I wanted to share in terms of about the basic story, and also kind of some of the problems posed by reporting and writing about it. And then also briefly talk a little bit about what is the importance of this particular story, why right now. One of the things is, I think that Tzompaxtle's experience, like what we get from his in-depth narration from inside, is a vision, a detailed vision of the infrastructure of torture and forced disappearance. Why? So by infrastructure, I mean the people who did this to him not only were trained, but they boasted about their training while they tortured him at the School of the Americas and at the Guatemalan Counterinsurgency School of the Caribe. They used radios, they used vehicles, they transported him, he's disappeared, right, using the national highway system, which has, toll booths, which are policed, staffed by full-time army police guards, right. They were able to transit these highways. They're moving him from clandestine prison to clandestine prison. Some of them apparently not located inside of military barracks or police bases, others located inside. The one he escapes from in the end was inside of a military base right outside of Mexico City in Teotihuacan. So this is this vision of someone who lived this experience. Very few people can tell, who lived this experience, lived to tell about it, which gives us an incredible, detailed analysis, anatomy of infrastructure of the practices of torture and forced disappearance. This is not the first time for someone to provide a vision of this kind of infrastructure, but in the late 1990s in Mexico it is. There's no other account from inside in that time period. And this is a time period when the state is telling the world and its citizens that it doesn't do that anymore. That's a thing of the past, right? That's a thing of the 1970s. And the PRI wouldn't even acknowledge that yet. When Fox comes into power in 2000, there's the appointment of a special prosecutor's office to investigate crimes of the past, and the past is firmly delineated in 1982-83, right? Anything after 1982-83, that's not the past, right? We can't talk about that. Too close. Right? And which is a part of this myth of the dirty war tactics of counterinsurgency as being something isolated in a remote and a discrete past, the beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Such that the state's discourse of democratization and now the myth of the transition, the democratic transition, right, can continue to thrive and flourish. And it's not only that, so we have this discourse, or this description from inside, which enables us to see the infrastructure of torture and disappearance. but it's also at a key political moment. It's the last sexennial of the PRI, 6-year term of the PRI before the 12 years of the PAN. The PRI's back now. What happened in these 12 years, right? And what happened with these practices? The argument that I make is that the practices not only continue and thrive, but that they have expanded, multiplied, and diversified in devastating and disastrous ways. That the way to understand much of the so-called drug war violence is by tracing its roots into the state practices of counterinsurgency and state terror. That this is where these individuals were trained, right? As well as the early infrastructure was created. You'll see in the types of people and equipment necessary to carry out torture and forced disappearance, member of an armed movement, are the same as what the armed groups are using now in the so-called drug war. And here I wanted to use Achille Mbembe's essay Necropolitics to kind of pause theoretically and think about this. He talks about 3 characteristics of necropower, right? Which are the dynamics of territorial fragmentation, vertical sovereignty, the proliferation of sites of violence, and the state of siege as military institution. I kind of did an exercise of looking at this story of Andres and the counterinsurgency of the 1990s and the drug war dynamic in relation to these 3 characteristics of necropower, right? So you have the dynamics of territorial fragmentation. In the dirty war, the clandestine prisons, the torture centers, both inside and out of military bases, as well as the kind of transit routes. And by territorial fragmentation, I think theoretically he's talking about like a separation, right? He takes the occupied territories of Palestine as his example in Mbembe's essay of like a separation of the ground from the air, like these overpasses and byways and bridges that will separate the occupied population from the occupier, right? And here you have that with the Mexican state, but it's invisible instead of being visible, right? The operation of the death squads and the clandestine torture centers, which in the context of the drug war takes place, but on a vastly expanded scale. And both still in cases of counterinsurgency, political violence, which continues up until the present day, as well as various forms of state, parastate, and non-state armed actors. Mbembe takes the concept from Deleuze-Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus of the war machine, right? The kind of war machine somehow extracted from the state, but still like in a fluid sense, so the state can like transform itself into a war machine and back, or contract a war machine to do the killing. And here, if you think about what happens in the state of Tamaulipas, especially between 2010 and 2012, and the difference between the toll roads and the non-toll roads. Toll roads in Mexico are rather expensive, so a lot of people, for economic reasons, will travel using the non-toll roads, which are much slower and not as nice. But in Tamaulipas, which is a border state, which leads up to one of the busiest border crossings on the planet, which is an intense amount of commerce, also like very working class commerce, people who will cross that border to do shopping in McAllen and bring stuff to then take it all the way to Tepito or take it to Chilpancingo to do mayoreo, right? Like large scale sales and distribution. Like there's a lot of working class traffic that goes across that border in many ways. And that became one of the non-toll roads became one of the principal sites of death during 2010, 2012. The stories of the Central American migrants, right? That the buses would arrive in Nuevo Laredo empty but full of suitcases, right? You had bus after bus arriving in Nuevo Laredo where the bus drivers would get off, their bus would be empty, and they'd be unloading suitcases that no one would claim, right? And the state didn't do anything. And it wasn't until August of 2010 with the massacre of 72 Central American and some South American migrants in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, which only became visible to the state because a handful of people survived and were able to crawl out. That kind of brought this attention. I remember there's a devastating editorial published by amazing El Salvadoran journalist named Oscar Martinez, whose book just got translated to English. In English, it's called The Beast. The politics of the title in Spanish is very intense. In Spanish, it's called Los Migrantes que no importan, right? The migrants that are not important, the non-important, the unimportant migrants. He has been documenting violence against Central American migrants in their transit through Mexico since 2006. And he wrote an editorial in 2010 after there was all of this kind of outrage, and he actually used the word hoopla about the massacre in San Fernando, called "See You at the Next Massacre," and basically excoriated the state and excoriated the liberal media for not having paid attention for 4 years of this kind of systematic violence, and for pretending to be surprised. And he's like, everybody knows, everybody knew. It was there, but nobody cared. Until, for some reason, one of these massacres became visible, right? Unavoidable, or impossible to deny. But here is an example of these kinds of dynamics of territorial fragmentation, right? And then proliferation of sites of violence. I think that's one of the best ways to understand. Like in the 1990s, there were less than 20 cases in the mid-1990s of forced disappearance. From 2006 to 2012, official estimates are between 26 and 27,000 cases of forced disappearance. So think about the handful of clandestine torture centers in Guerrero State that military intelligence is able to use to torture this individual, and the mass proliferation of those centers. They're now all over the country, right? Both used by the state still, as well as kind of parastate and non-state. It's totally fluid and fractured. But there's, what part of the official discourse is that all of this violence is warring bands of drug traffickers, right? Right. One of the quickest ways to kind of dispel that idea is take a look at what happens in Ciudad Juarez from 2008 to 2010. In late 2008, when the army is sent into Juarez to fully occupy 2007,